Hello, Dr. Ron England, and this is part 2 of model-based development with MVC. If you've seen the part 1, you'll notice I'm using Visual Studio 2015, and I created a MVC project. And in the MVC project, I created a model called user data entry, which had a few properties. And what we're going to look at in part 2 is the controller. We looked at the model, and there's really not a whole lot to look at for the model. It's the model. It's just a class with some properties. So let's look at the controller itself, and I'm going to look specifically at the user data entries controller, the one that goes with the user data entries. And I'm going to actually look at this, do this by looking at the code. Now realize this code was generated by Microsoft, but before I actually start into there, I've got, if we want to look at it running, if I went to user data entries, okay, and I just went to that at the end of the URL there, I'm going to actually get this index page, which is the one that was created. Now you're looking at a view, but the controller made the view. Okay, and if I went to here and I said, okay, now if I typed in at the end of that index, it's going to be the same page. If I click on the edit, it's going to have edit, and that was record 1 because there's only one record, but if you look up here, you'll see edit and 1. If I take away the 1, okay, it's going to give me a bad request because you can't do the edit without any of those fields. And you also notice that you got a details page, and it's the same thing. You're going to have details with a 1. If I take away the 1, I'm going to get the bad request. And there's also one for user data entries. There's also one for create. So you can actually see how the URLs themselves work, and the create gives you a user data entry create screen. All right, so you can see all that, but that's actually all coming from the controller. So let's look at the controller here. So here's my user data entries controller, and it inherits from controller itself. So it actually inherits from system.web.mvc controller. Here's a private property, application DB context, and I have this because I need a database context because my application is going to and from the database. Now, this application DB context, let's look at where this is actually being defined. So let's go to the definition. And over here in identitymodels.cs, and the reason it, by the way, is using this DB context is because when I created it, I said, use an existing DB context, use this one. Because it asked me to do this. Well, what is a DB context? Well, it actually controls getting to and from, how to get things to and from the database. This isn't what controlled the format of the database or made the database. That was all Entity Framework, which is separate from MVC. We're using both Entity Framework and MVC here. But in this case, I've got this class called Application DB Context, which essentially has the ability to say, hey, you know what? I can open a connection and do stuff. That's pretty much what I'm looking at, opening a connection to a database and doing stuff. And right here, this public application DB context here is saying, hey, you know what? In the base, I've got this method base that allow me to instantiate the application DB context, make this class with two properties that can go to this method. Default connection is the name, is which connection string are you going to be using, and this other one is a Boolean called throw version 1 schema. If the schema matches on identity 1.0.0. We're not going to worry about that right now, but you can delve into that and figure out what that means. It's not that hard. It's basically saying, hey, when you create and use the identity model, if the tables don't exist in the database, it makes them. It puts them in. The one that we're really interested in is this one property down here, public. This is a DB set, and it's a DB set of user data entry. Okay, of the actual models, the user data entry, that, by the way, is the class that we made, okay, called user data entries with a get set. So this is a property of this type, okay, called user data entries with its accessor get set here. Okay, so I can get, what bottom line of this is I can get these from the database and I can set them in the database, and a lot of this stuff is being handled in code that Microsoft has written behind the scenes, and I'm just inheriting this functionality. So let's go back to this controller and see what's going on. First, let's look at what, I'm going to close all these because it kind of makes it easy to see each of the individual methods as I do this. So I'm going to close all these methods, and what you'll probably notice is, and I think I've closed enough that you can see this, I've got this public method called index. that returns an action result. I have this public method called details that returns an action result. I have a public method called create that returns an action result. Okay, I think you're getting the idea here. I've got these public methods that return action results, and if you probably have figured out by now, the names of those methods matched the URL up here. Well, yeah, that's by design. That's part of the architecture of MVC. So let's go ahead and open up this method. Let's open up the index method and look a little bit deeper at what's going on. Now, all of these are going to say they're going to return a view, and a view is a controller.view, and it's a view result. It comes, can come back. That's the type of class that it is, and it's built into the base class that I inherited from in controller. Okay, which is right here. User data entry is controller, inherits from controller. So it's built in, but it's built into the base class. And I return a view, and the view returns DB user data entries to list. Well, there we go, to list. So what is db.userdataentries? Well, remember DB is the DB up here, which is an application DB context. And DB should better have a property called user data entries. Okay, so it does, which is a DB set of user data entries, and I can then convert this to a list. I can convert this data set to a list and return it with the view. And what's going to happen is the view is going to be able to easily render that list. It won't go to index, so back to list. It can easily render this on the screen. The view can do that. We're not looking at the view right now. We're looking at the controller. So the controller just says, get it, return it. Okay, get it, return it. Get it, return it. Well, let's go to the next one. Details. Well, details, as you recall, gave me the details for simply one record. Okay, well, that's straightforward. Naming convention makes sense. I got this thing, well, int question mark. As a question is like, what is an int question mark? Well, an int is an integer. An int question mark is a nullable property. In other words, ID, if it's an integer, can never take the value null. But if it's an int question mark, it can take the value null, which is sometimes important because what happens if I go over here and put details and I don't put the 1 there? Okay, well, if I don't put the 1 there, what's the value of that index going to be? Well, you can't have it be 0 because that could possibly be something that has a meaning. Well, you got to let it be null. If it's a null, you're going to get this screen. Well, how does that happen? Well, if ID equals null, you're going to return a new HTTP status code result, HTTP bad request. You're going to return that, which is what you see. However, if it's not null, if it's actually something that makes sense, okay, you're going to actually create a new user data entry. Remember, that's the class we made. That's the model. Okay, and it's going to use, oh, there's my database context again. There's the accessor, the property user data entries. And there, oh, there's a method find. Well, user data entries, as you recall, is a DB set. Okay, find must be one of the legal methods of that data set. And I pass it the ID. Well, yes, it is. Behind the scenes, it's going to go to the database. It's going to put together a SQL query and do that. Now, let's play with this for just a second. I'm going to do some fun stuff right here. I'm going to first go to Glimpse, because I use Glimpse to actually look, glimpse.axd. I think I have Glimpse installed. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and turn Glimpse on. Glimpse lets me look at stuff. Okay, now I can go out of, so Glimpse is now turned on. I'm going to go back to user data entries. Hopefully I spelled it right. User data entries. I'll go ahead and just let it go to the index there. And now I got this little thing at the bottom with the G. And if I click on the G, it's going to let me go to my SQL, which is one of the tabs in there, and you can actually scroll down here and see what SQL is actually happening here. And if you notice, the SQL that returned this is the SQL down here. By the way, it created the SQL. So if I hit the details, that SQL is going to change. I'm going to go down here, and you're going to get select top, okay, from, and then here we go where the ID equals 1. Okay, so there's the SQL that actually got run. That's pretty interesting. So you can see that it generated some SQL right there. All right, so wow, this one's running even longer than I thought it was going to run, but let's go back over to here. So it got that record, okay, and check to see if it was null. If it wasn't null, it returns the view with that user data entry, which, by the way, is the model that I created called user data entry, and it returns that back to the view, and there's one of them, and the view better know what to do with it, okay? So far, so good. Create. Well, create's got a couple of properties. I'm not going into those properties just yet. And the fact that you can see that this probably makes logical sense that this attribute is going to handle an HTTP post. So this is probably going to be something to do with the post of, and if you remember your web systems, post, get, those are, know what those are. And it returns an action result, okay, but look what it takes. Create, okay, so the create method of this actually takes an argument. Well, let's see, what is it doing here? It's create. It takes a user data entry. So it's getting some information here. Remember, this is my model class, user data entry. User data entry in lowercase is the instantiation of the user data entry, and it's got this attribute here, bind, and the bind has the include, and it has actually the names of the field that are going to be bound. So if you look at the bind, you can say, hey, it represents an attribute, and oh look, and it's got the include. Well, what can you do with a bind? Well, if you want to know what you can do with a bind, just open the parentheses right there. Oops, I'm actually running code, sorry. I could stop that. I don't need to be running the code right now. Okay, if I open the parentheses there, you can actually, well, look, it's got an exclude, it's got an include, and a prefix. So essentially what you're saying is, okay, well, this property is telling, hey, and you can look at it and really tell what it's doing. It's saying, put these fields bound to this user data entry. And if I go in a little deeper, it's going to check on the model state, which, by the way, is built in the controller. Okay. It's going to, if the model state is valid, okay, well, somehow it's going to be checking that model state. Remember, that model state, we defined that model state. We defined the model. We defined if the state, what makes a valid model state. What might not make a valid model state, hey, putting in bad data, does it fail authentication? Those are all things that can determine whether a model state is valid or not, and we told the system what those were. So, what do? DB. Remember, DB, application DB context. It can connect to the database. User data entries. That's the property that is the DB set, the database set, that is the actual user data entries. And now I got add. Well, you should understand what add is. Add is, oh, I need to add something to the database. And I'm going to add the user data entry, which is my model. Okay, well, that makes sense. I added a model to there. It's going back in. It hopefully maps over very correctly. It looks like it's all happening behind the scenes somewhere. And then I say save changes. Well, basically, I'm committing the transaction. It is a database. And then return redirect to action index. Oh, it's going back to the index page. And then return to view user data entry. Well, that's not that cryptic. Okay? These all should be starting to make sense. Well, edit, same thing. Edit, int, a nullable integer field. If it's null, bad request. Okay? Let's go ahead and let's find the data right here, user data entry. There's your model. Going to the context, finding based on the ID. If the user data entry is null, hey, we can't do anything. Otherwise, you can go ahead and return to view. Okay? I'm going to stop there. You can kind of see what's going on here. It's pretty straightforward. You can look through this code. Students in my class, if you don't understand what's going on in the code, okay, you need to be able to look at this code and understand what's going on based on it. Now you're not going to get in a whole lot into what's happening behind the scenes, but we are going to start delving into this code because you need to be able to write your own controllers. Make sure you understand that. You need to be able to write your own controllers, which means you need to understand if you're going back and forth to a database, and realize that DB context only really exists if you're planning on taking data to and from a database. Okay? Controller takes the request, what does the user want to do, looks at the model, puts it all together, pops it in a view, that's what the user sees. Okay, it's doing the heavy lifting, but reality is most of the heavy lifting is being done behind the scenes in this application. So that was just step one of getting to understand controllers. If you've looked at one and you understand what a model is, now you're looking at seeing what a controller is, and then the next step is we gotta manage what it looks like when you see it on screen. So I bet you can guess what part 3 is: understanding the view. So hope you enjoyed this. I got you through a little bit more of it, and good programming.